Okay, welcome back after a well-deserved break. We have been listening to two presentations of today already, and the next one is just up. So a very warm welcome to Dr. Nicholas Krohley, looking into a presentation which is labeled like a shared value of preposition. Before we dive into the presentation as such, and I leave the floor to Nicholas, I like to introduce Nicholas as well. Dr. Nicholas Krohley is the principal of Frontline Advisory. He advises clients in the public and private sector on the human environment of their operations, including civil-oriented military and intelligence capabilities in the United States, United Kingdom, Iraq, Ukraine, and Nigeria. He has held a fellowship with the Modern Warfare Institute at West Point and King's College London, and served previously with the US Army's Human Terrain System. He holds a PhD and a master's degree in Middle East and Mediterranean Studies from King's College London, and a bachelor's in history from Yale University. Nicholas, may I ask you whether you're with us?
I'm here. Yes, sir.
Great to have you on board again. It's not the first time that you keep joining our seminars and provide your expertise. So the floor is actually yours. Please start your presentation and let me know what slides I should move forward.
Excellent. Well, thank you for having me back. I must be doing something right. Thank you to everyone for a bit of your time on this. I'd like to offer what I couch as a private sector perspective on Simek and CA. And I say this as someone who does broadly similar work and who tries to take on the same kinds of challenges. And with the guiding questions of today, and with a lot of discussions I've had the past several years with practitioners in CA and in Simek, I'll offer a view on what I see as the status quo and where things go. It's a bit critical at the outset, and I would just say that criticism is offered as someone who cares, who believes in what CA and Simek are doing, are trying to do, and who believes in uniform personnel owning this whole proposition, in contrast to programs like the Human Terrain System in the past, which tried to throw civilians at the problem. So if you go to the next slide, I'll lay out a couple of premises so you understand my perspective and why I'm coming from this the way that I am. And the first one, again, I say it not to be unkind, having been invited here, but I think it's an observation that has to get made. That Simek and CA are not where they ought to be, in my view, in terms of how they're valued, how they're positioned, how they're resourced. CA and Simek ought to be integral and essential and front and center with a seat at the high table in any of these discussions when we talk about understanding operational environments. Because I don't know that anyone would dispute that the U.S. military and NATO have to understand where we compete, where we fight, where we operate writ large. And I'd argue that the further we get away from an enemy or an adversary or a competitor, however you want to frame that, the more uncomfortable we are as organizations. I'm speaking now of the military and of NATO. And I think that any plausible operational environment is going to be at least 90% civilian. And if we don't know what to do with that 90%, how to look at it, what to do with the insights, we get real blind spots. And the last 20 years of our collective professional lives have been in part, I think, a testament to that. What happened in Iraq, what happened in Afghanistan. And these aren't problems you can put at the feet of Simek and CA. These are big picture institutional problems, whereby strategically minded organizations aren't looking at things or aren't seeing things they need to see. And there are two explanations for this. One is that the U.S. military and CA, or sorry, the U.S. military and NATO don't realize the blind spots that they have, that they think they have it more or less under control, and they don't fully appreciate the problem of contending with that 90% of an operational environment. And the other is that they're aware of these blind spots, but don't particularly care about them. They're content with them. And the older I get, the more sense the second argument makes. That if you look at Simek, you look at CA, resourced and equipped and staffed as they are, there is no realistic prospect of mastering 90% of an operation environment. That's a policy choice. That's a strategic choice that's been made in terms of resource allocation. And so we are, on our back foot from step one when we try to engage with this vast problem set, this massively, critically, fundamentally important problem set. How does it happen? How are we going to do it? I started this off again a bit negatively, just to try to fight against any argument that status quo is more or less all right, and that we kind of got under control and we're going in the right direction. From an outsider's view, that's not the case. Not for lack of talent and effort and sacrifice, which I've seen working alongside a number of you. But something has to give, something has to change. How do we do it? Okay, and the real challenge when we talk about innovation or disruption is that no one's going to give us any extra resources to do it. So we have to make a case for Simek and CA, which I think are, again, two sides of the same coin, in the same boat. They're broadly comparable capabilities with broadly or very comparable mission sets. They have to change that status quo. They have to. If you go to the next slide, please. And when we think about, how to do that, the idea of change without resource, without support necessarily. Oh, can you go to the next one? Sorry, maybe there's a delay. All right, awesome. I sit and I look at Simek and CA, looking at doctrine, looking at the tasks that are there. It's immense, and it's I would say insurmountable. There's simply too much there. There's the tagline of CA, and it's an English expression. So, the jack of all trades, right? We can do a bit of everything. We're always helpful. We're always offering something. And I get that. But the expression in full is, the jack of all trades, the master of none, right? And if you take a more private sector view of this and you try to think about, conveying a value proposition and being essential, being integral, there are a lot of people smarter than I am who would tell you, you got to master something. If you spread yourself too thin, you're inevitably going to run up against inconsistency, uncertainty, underperformance. That the risk of mediocrity is there. Again, not for lack of talent or initiative, but just for trying to do too many things in too many different ways in incredibly challenging environments. Next slide, please. Because, thinking about that and thinking about CA and Simek, existing in what I think a lot of us would agree as an unsatisfactory status quo, how do we change that? What do we do? And I'd offer up this idea of simplification, of being excellent at something, demonstrably excellent at something. And this, again, I've raised this before in similar venues and in private conversations with different people in CA and Simek communities. And there's resistance to the word abandoning gets used a lot. Like walk away from other obligations. And I agree with that. But it's a false choice, right? Because if you're asked to do too much with too little, and you try to pivot toward on something really important and doing it right, it's not a question of abandoning what you are asked to do. It's a question of reconciling an impossible mission set with limited resources. And what I'd suggest is if we can be excellent at something with the resources we have now, without any additional expense, build from that. The statement at the bottom is tenable. We can go to our respective chains of command, our respective organizations, and say, look, with the resources we had, we did this. And you saw it, you valued it, it was excellent. It's essential now. If you give us X plus whatever, we can do more. And you start to build, again, this evidence-based case for CA as providers of, I'd say providers of essential services. And that's a commercial bit of language, right? I guess implies CA and Simek as being outside vendors. And I don't mean it. We do provide a service, right, to the Army, to NATO. understanding, engaging, potentially governing that 90% of an operational environment. Again, massively difficult. I'd argue, more or less impossible within current resource allocation. Next slide, please. And again, I'm biased in this because this is what I do. This is what I've chosen to do, for the last 15 years. But I think NATO and the U.S. military are still really struggling in the human domain. We're not sure what we want to know. We're not sure how to find it. We're not sure what to do with it. I think that when we talk about civil reconnaissance, civil assessment, there's an opportunity to master something here through the professionalization of how, through different methods, different approaches, more compelling products. Having worked on the Simek CA comparison paper that was referenced earlier, and looking at the doctrinally prescribed outputs of Simek and CA, it's not that exciting, right? Area studies, running estimate, deliberate assessments. This isn't necessarily compelling stuff. And being in the CA orbit for a long time, there's been talk about CA branding problem or marketing. And again, offering a private sector view here, if you have a marketing problem, it's because you're not communicating your value effectively. And the best way to do that is by delivering something, all right, that is, again, obviously and essentially useful and of top quality. And it has to be compelling, it has to be digestible, to be something that the customer, in this case, the U.S. military, higher commands in NATO, either always knew they needed and never had, or didn't know they needed until they saw it. And that's where I think there's an opportunity for innovation, creativity within CA, within Simek, in trying to take on that understanding, that lack of understanding, that problem that I opened up, these blind spots that our organizations have. Because it could be that there are individuals or entities within the U.S. military and NATO that didn't quite appreciate the blind spots they had until they were presented in compelling, digestible form. Or it could be there were those who were skeptics of the whole enterprise, saying, we don't want to dance in this whole space. We don't want anything to do with this. And you show them their eyes saying, wow, yeah, you're right. We do need that. Slide, please. And, again, I'll close this. Sweet. I'm happy to talk through this in questions or offline, but I think when we talk about CA and Simek as two sides of the same coin or trying to fulfill the same mission set, that value proposition, that the area in which both capabilities can be essential is in delivering that understanding of, again, the other 90% of an operation is neglected now. And there's a chicken and egg argument to make, right? I mean, are CA and Simek a bit marginal because the institutions they serve don't know the area they're tasked to cover? Or is it the opposite? Are NATO and the U.S. military skeptical of contextual understanding because they haven't gotten what they're looking for yet, or they haven't figured out how to engage with this material? Either way, I think it falls to us to change that. No one's going to change it for us. And if you think about doing that, there are two pieces to it. One is the investigative process. And, I've been talking for as long as anyone would listen to me about ASCOPE and PMISI just not being the answer, not being remotely up to the task, and the need for better investigative methods that show us where to look and how to look and why we're looking. All right, to have this explained. ASCOPE and PMISI, you can call it a cartographer, you call it a librarian. We're putting things in their place. We're not investigating. This has to be an investigative proposition. All right, and what do we want to produce here? Okay, the area study isn't the answer. No one reads area studies. All right, and there are a dime a dozen out there, think tanks and the rest of it. We need, and what I would put forward is that if we want to take NATO and the U.S. military out of their comfort zones out of that J2 focus on the 2 to 10% of an operational environment that's the enemy, we may have to lead them by the nose, literally. We may have to force them to broaden their view. And the best way to do that is by framing civil reconnaissance, framing contextual assessment around the roots that J2 problems sink into the human terrain. Islamic State established roots in Syria and Iraq. How did the Russians project their influence-based roots across Eastern Europe? What are the roots of Chinese influence? All right, that's, I think, the beginning of a core deliverable that layers on naturally to any J2 product, and that even the most skeptical commander could look at. That is interesting. I see how all this civil contextual stuff ties back to what really brought me here in the first place, and what really, gets me out of bed in the morning, however you want to phrase it. And by gradually building out from that product, you can go down and explain, well, here's how the roots grew, and here's why they grew, and here are the social, cultural, economic, political factors, very specifically in very particular fields of the human terrain that matter, based upon our adversary's ability to establish roots there, or not. Next slide, please. I believe that's the end. I'm going to push this out as an outsider's perspective. As someone who kind of works in the same space in a way and has worked with a number of you in the past, I would push CA and Simek to look inward for new ideas, and to be dissatisfied, a little bit pissed off maybe at the fact that Simek and CA aren't as important as they ought to be. They aren't valued in the way they need to be for us to be effective. And you can look to the last 20 years, around that, and look next year. I don't see that changing. I'd love to hear a compelling argument for the human domain not mattering in Russia and Ukraine right now. Most of the leaders working in Ukraine, Brits and Ukrainians, and they get it, they know it. We need to make our case collectively for why it matters. If you take anything away from my time here, which is done now, it's to try to find an answer to that. Offer your 2 cents, speak up. Thanks very much. Bye for questions after the fact.